Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. And yes, I am back. Here I am, hooray! And the crowd goes wild. Why don't we do a live, a live recording of this podcast? Why do we always have to do it in this room, just us with our laptops?
No, absolutely.
Let's do a live recording.
Well, the rest is politics. The rest is history. I mean, don't they now sell out Royal Albert Hall?
I'm glad you mentioned our sister podcast because they do and have done. And I think, Emmanuel Centre, we could do it there. And if there's any willing, rich Christian listening to this podcast who benefits personally from the content, the content we're giving, get in contact with CARE and maybe offer to fund a live recording to really take the podcast to the next level. I've come back off my leave, and I just think the thing that I want to drive in 2025, lots of things, but one of them is let's take the Engage podcast to the next level. How about that?
Well, James, you mentioned you're back from leave.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us about how your leave was?
Okay, but I don't want to spend too long on this because while it is very exciting for me personally, one of the things that I'm very keen on as a new dad is my life is naturally dominated by my beautiful daughter, Azura Faith Mildred, born on the 23rd of November at 22:18. Both Cara, my wife, and Azura doing great. That's all I need to say. Being a dad is wonderful. It's also very humbling, very challenging in lots of ways, but the Bible says children are a gift from the Lord, and that is so true. And I'm just very conscious of friends and lots of people out there I know who would love to be in the position that we are in and find it difficult, or it hasn't happened yet. And so I'm always careful, or I'll try to always be careful to honor and acknowledge that God has blessed us in this way. And we're very, very grateful, but your heart goes out to people who would love to be in the position we're in and for various reasons aren't. That's Azura. That's why I was off. I was off for 6 weeks. How did you survive? It's my question. I'm only joking. How was it? Was it all right?
I had a great time.
Yeah, stop. What worries me is everyone said that to me, and I'm not entirely convinced that anyone is glad to see me back, which is a horrible feeling. So if you listening or watching this are glad to see me back, then if you could drop a comment or just send a note, it could be a private email, anything. Please.
Don't feed his ego.
No, there's no ego. I'm a new man. I'm a dad. I'm a father. I'm a new man. Peter, how was your Christmas? How was your New Year?
It was very nice, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, no, I had a really lovely break.
Were you with your side of the family or with your Sophie's side of the family?
We were with my parents for Christmas this time, which was very nice. We had Sophie's parents down to come and stay with us after that, and then we spent various days pootling around various National Trust properties.
Oh gosh!
Because although we are in our late 20s/early 30s, we behave as if we were in our 70s, and I have no shame in doing so.
No, that's right. No one watching or listening to this is surprised by what you've just said.
No, absolutely not.
No one is surprised that you've admitted that you act like a 75-year-old man.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that's a great stage of life.
I think you're right, and I obviously am much younger, much more contemporary. Noticed the skinny tie, for example, kind of the nod to modernity, while I've taken to wearing a suit again since coming back because it just helps me separate my work from my personal life a little bit. It's a personal choice. Don't hate me. Hate is gonna hate. That's what Taylor Swift taught me to say.
Indeed.
We're covering all the subjects, aren't we?
I feel we are covering all the subjects other than the ones we are supposed to be talking about.
Yes, I know, but I'm bringing the energy again. The energy's back. Energy on the podcast is back.
Well, why don't you transition?
Yes, okay.
James, transition Mildred.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you bring us into
Well,
where we're
speaking
going
of bringing
today?
the energy, there's been a heck of a lot of political energy.
Oh, very good.
That was amazing in the United States because we're recording in the same week that they inaugurated in the Capitol building because of severe cold. I mean, the temperature in Washington, D.C. was something like -6 or 7, maybe even colder. But they've inaugurated the 47th president of the United States. And I guess my opening question to you, Peter, is, are you ready for Donald Trump 2.0?
I'm not sure I was really ready for 1.0. I mean, it's obviously an interesting moment. We know that every leader will come with their positives and their negatives, and that is sort of part of Christian doctrine, isn't it? That we are all capable of good because we're made in the image of God. We are all also flawed because we are fallen beings. And so regardless of whether you would have voted for Trump or not, I think it is important to say this is not a simple matter of one side good, one side bad, Republicans bad, Democrats good, or whatever. with Donald Trump as president, it's unlikely there'll be much in the way of dull moments. He is a headline grabber, and he will do various things, some of which I will agree with, some of which I won't. Did you watch the inauguration?
Yeah, I had it on in the background, obviously with the time difference. When it got to his speech, that coincided with the point at which I wanted to go home. So I chose to prioritize going home over listening to his, I think it was 30-minute speech or something like that.
Well, I thought I would just catch up on the BBC's 2-minute highlight video, because I didn't really want to watch it all.
Yeah, I mean, I can't repeat what was said in 2017 when he was inaugurated for the first time. But the former president, George W. Bush, allegedly turned to somebody near him after Donald Trump had given his inaugural speech and said, that was some pretty weird, and then a word for human excrement.
Yeah.
And I suspect that if that's what he thought in 2017, then he would have thought exactly the same this time round. And it is one of the strange quirks of the inauguration that you have the living former presidents, if they're well enough, sitting there. So the thing that struck me was, here's Donald Trump standing up and he's openly saying, I'm going to reverse all of these Biden-led policies. And Biden's having to sit there and sort of try to maintain a sort of fairly sort of, maybe not neutral, I would say stony was the word that was used on social media, which I think was accurate. But it must be difficult because the guy, that's his legacy. And this another old guy, and he's only 4 years younger than him, Donald Trump, by the way, is the oldest man to be inaugurated to the presidency. So Joe Biden was slightly younger than Donald Trump when he was inaugurated in 2021. Isn't that absolutely fascinating? I mean, so that there's that whole dynamic of we saw how age became a really big issue for Joe Biden. And we know from the Bible that, old age does not mean that you lack usefulness, that you lack ability, that you're still worthy of dignity, you're to be treated well, you're to be honored because of the wisdom that age is supposed to bring. But clearly, the demands of the job of being the president of the biggest and most powerful country in the world, biggest in terms of GDP, is huge. And I continue to believe that America would be well served by having some sort of rule that says if you are this age or older, you can't serve as president. The Catholic Church apply that rule when it comes to cardinals and voting. You get to a certain age and you're encouraged to resign. And when you get to a certain age, 80 and above, you can't vote anymore in the conclave. Now, that's just to recognize that, yes, age brings wisdom, but also age brings often greater infirmity and lack of energy. So I'm a bit troubled by the fact that Donald Trump will be 78 now, he'll be 82 by the time his term finishes. And I just think it doesn't matter how fit you are, the demands of that job are huge. And I worry about that. Yeah,
I guess it's a really interesting balance to strike biblically, isn't that? Because we do know in the Bible that there are various people who are fruitful in older age. And Moses is sort of 80 when he's leading the nation of Israel out of slavery. But having said that, quite rightly, you point to there are pragmatic difficulties, and that was so obviously the case with Sleepy Joe.
Yes.
Who was clearly sort of not up to the demands of the office, certainly by the time he'd finished, and possibly even when he started. So I think there is a tricky balance to strike there in terms of how we affirm the gifts which our old age has, and also we don't want to be ruling people out of stuff when they are capable of doing really great things, but also recognizing pragmatically there are difficulties.
Yes. Why don't we cut to what I think is the heart of the challenge for evangelicals and Donald Trump? Because, I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? Is that I think over here in this country, evangelicals and the wider British population generally have a very dim view of Donald Trump.
Not the case in America.
Not the case in America, where, for example, you just had to listen to some of the prayers. So I made a note of who gave prayers during the inauguration. Well, fascinatingly, the first one was from Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who's the Archbishop of New York. And interestingly, he did not, according to Religion News Service, he did not endorse Donald Trump.
In his prayer?
No, just didn't endorse him in the election.
Okay,
yes, right. Which I thought was fascinating. And I thought his prayer was written, but it was delivered in a very eccentric style. But I thought it was a fair and even-handed attempt to pray for a president that clearly he himself personally did not endorse. Then we had the Reverend Franklin Graham, who may be known to those watching, the son of the late Billy Graham, and a passionate supporter of Donald Trump. Has been very vocal in his support, and his prayer, that's the conclusion you would come to from his prayer. Then we had a rabbi, Ari Berman, who's the president of the Yeshiva University, an Orthodox Jewish school in New York City. There was supposed to be an imam, but he was either, I couldn't work out if he was dropped or if there was a big pressure on time. So I wonder if it was sort of just dropped just to try to kind of help speed up the inauguration. But we also had someone called the Reverend Lorenzo Suo, who is the senior pastor of 180 Church in Detroit. And he talked about the millimeter miracle in his prayer of how Donald Trump survived the bullet that was fired at him by a millimeter. And he made a link with Martin Luther King because they were marking Martin Luther King's, what would have been his birthday. Yeah. And he was talking about Luther King's dream and praying that Donald Trump would help see Martin Luther King's dream of a genuinely fair and equal society realized. And again, so all of that to say that you have this strange allegiance between certain parts of evangelicalism and overt support for Trump. And I just find it all troubling.
Well, I certainly find it troubling. I guess let's break that down into two parts. So let's first of all try and understand why there is that allegiance.
Yes.
Because I think probably to those who are massively in favour, it probably makes a great deal of sense that they support him.
Of course.
I think part of that is that in recent years, the Democrats have pushed far too hard on policies which are sort of quite explicitly anti what a Christian message would be. So things like policies on abortion. So it feels like we've moved some way from the sort of Bill Clinton position in the 90s of safe, legal and rare on abortion, where now there would be many who would advocate for abortion on demand.
Yes, although I still continue to believe that Clinton line was less conviction and more pragmatism.
Oh, I'm sure pragmatism,
it was. But yes.
I'm sure it was. But I guess the point is that the stated position has changed a lot. I think that with Trump, he has taken a much stronger stance on things like gender and to some extent the sort of wider LGBT issues. I think too that there has been, in some ways, a really troubling way amongst some parts of the evangelical right to almost view, first of all, Obama actually, but then Biden and Harris as almost satanic, which I think is a really, really dangerous move.
The same charge, of course, could be levelled at people who think Trump is satanic.
Indeed.
And so those on the left who are Christians on the left who argue that.
But I guess the point really is that for some, the politics has become so polarised that they cannot see any good in what their opponents are doing. And that actually takes us back to where we were at the start, where I was sort of saying, well, actually, everyone is created with a capacity for good, made in the image of God, whilst also being fallen. And it's like the politics are so polarised, they've forgotten half of that equation.
So let's get to the heart of this, which what evangelicals have had to weigh up in 2024 is the classic conundrum of which do you prioritize? Do you prioritize the policy program of the candidate or the character of the candidate? And this is where there was in 2020, there was a really fascinating and I think helpful exchange between John Piper on the one hand, who said he couldn't vote for either candidate in 2020 because he chose to prioritize character, and then Wayne Grudem, who had been very supportive of Trump initially in 2016, then apologized for not taking his character more seriously, said in 2020 nonetheless that when given the choice between Trump and Biden, he was going to vote for Trump because he was going to prioritize the policy good that could be accomplished while recognizing the serious character flaws. Now, it seems to me that that's a relevant tension for us to consider here. And that, to me, gets us to the heart of this. When you listen to Franklin Graham, and I listen to the Reverend Lorenzo Suo praying about the millimeter miracle and giving thanks for it and so on, one of the things that really troubles me is this baptizing of what happened to Trump in the language of providence. And I hate to draw this comparison because Elon Musk says this is a lazy comparison that we're too quick to draw. But if you listen to any history of World War II, you will discover that Adolf Hitler, when he was spared in terms of the attempt on his life in July 1944, one of the things he said, and he said it prior to that as well, was that Providence, God, had chosen him for this mission. This way in which Christians in America have appointed Trump as a messianic-like figure and are determined to say, God has definitely chosen him. God has definitely... And do you know what I find troubling about it is it's the most pernicious error of all, because it's an error mixed with truth. Because we believe God raises up rulers and brings them down. So I have to, at one degree, say that the Lord is involved in the raising up of Trump to the presidency, just as I have to say in 2020, the Lord was involved in bringing Trump down and raising up Biden. But the truth applies to all rulers.
But it's that really is assuming that we know the mind of God, isn't it? Because for all we know, God could have raised up Trump for negative purposes for America.
Oh, absolutely.
Rather than to make America great again.
So the truth is that God is involved in raising up, but
we don't know why.
It's the next step I find troubling, of the assumption it must be for good reason.
Yeah.
And then when he launches all of these executive orders where he says there's only two genders, male and female, that's the official policy of the US government. When he bans all diversity, gender and inclusion programs in federal government and agencies, when he, even to the point of doing things like declaring an energy emergency, drill baby drill, and even when he says there's an emergency at the southern border, and evangelicals, some, not all, some, cheering and view it, this is proof that God has chosen Trump to accomplish good.
Yeah.
There's a lack of nuance that is so troubling.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even a lack of nuance. I mean, it is utterly devoid of being rooted in proper biblical text. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to pick up from in what you were talking about there. The first was on the sort of character versus policy. I actually feel like there's been less analysis of Trump as a character this time than there was on both of the two previous.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's just because people are like, well, we know what he's like?
That's exactly what it is. I think it's we've had that conversation already, and so I haven't seen that sort of difficult weighing up of factors this time. And the comparison which we had actually at our church on Sunday, which I thought was a very good comparison in terms of the way some Americans are speaking about Trump. Some are sort of talking about him as if he really is the new Cyrus kind of figure, where may not be the kind of character you would want, but this is the person who God is using to accomplish his big miracles. And now, as you say, God raises up all leaders. There are plenty of things which Trump does which are probably not great from a Christian point of view, just as there might be some which are good from a Christian point of view, and in particular, sort of his language demonizing immigrants is particularly not good from a Christian point of view. But there's also a kind of America is the central nation in world history kind of view to it. It's a sort of I guess what the young people would call main character energy.
Very good. But it's more than that, because for some evangelicals, it's America is now the new covenant nation, and they're the new Israel, and they're the chosen people. And all of this, and I mean that we have to completely reject, because in the New Testament it is abundantly clear there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, but you are all one in Christ. The new covenant is not a national covenant. It is a covenant made with individuals who are baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ, and from every tribe, tongue, and nation. There's no prioritizing of one nation over another.
And so this is one of my real problems. So because Trump himself used language which you were sort of talking about when you were talking about the millimeter miracle. Well, Trump himself said, didn't he, God saved me from a bullet in order to make America great again. Now, that really is okay, so I am saying I know why God has done what he's doing, and that's it.
And that's the issue, because actually the first bit I don't necessarily have a problem with. It's the why that's then attached to it, or the arrogant assumption of it must be to and then repeat your campaign slogan. There's no humility to say, well, actually, God may well have spared you from that, actually chiefly, so you've still got time to repent and believe in Jesus and respond in faith to the call of the gospel.
Yeah.
But of course, this is part of a bigger thing, which we must talk about on this podcast at some point. There is a new rise of a form of cultural co-opting of Christian values by people who wouldn't know what regeneration was and the new birth was if it slapped them in the face. And I find this, you see it with Jordan Peterson, you see it with other characters. I find it really frustrating that not enough is being done from the evangelical church to call out something that I think is explicitly wrong, which is you cannot just have the good of Christianity and reject the Savior who is at the heart of it. And that is also, I must say, for all that the Episcopalian Church in America has gone down many a wrong road when it comes to theology and doctrine, the fact that it was an Episcopal bishop who, again, I'm not saying I agree with everything, but had the courage to call out some of Trump's wrong behavior and ask him politely to have mercy on, for example, the children of migrants in America who are now scared because they might be separated from their parents. How come it took that to actually challenge him when Franklin Graham stood on a stage and you wouldn't think there was anything wrong with Donald Trump? You think he was the Messiah incarnate.
And did you see that a Republican has called for that bishop to be deported?
Even though she's an American citizen. I mean, it's just, exactly. So it's I've used the word, I've overused it on the podcast. I always have a word I overuse in podcasts. I've used the word troubling a lot, but I do find it troubling. But you said this, and I think you're right. I can understand as well some degree of, well, at least when it comes to policies, we're going to see some things that are consistent with Christian teaching.
Yeah, why don't you talk through some of those which are consistent, first of all?
Okay, so I'll run through just some of the highlights from the flurry of executive orders that Donald Trump passed. This is a tradition for the incoming president. I think the scale of what Trump has done is unusual. By the way, we should comment on the fact that, this is not some Joe Biden loving, far from it. Joe Biden issued an extraordinary 8,000 pardons over his presidency, according to one source that I looked at. And ended by pardoning 5 members of his family preemptively, from prosecution, claiming that he was protecting them from political attacks. Now, that just smacks of exactly the kind of dodginess that people then accused Trump of when he used executive orders, for example, to release people sentenced because of crimes committed during the 2021 Capitol riot. So anyway, swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
Well, I mean, corruption wherever you look.
Yes.
I mean, it's just a really, really sorry state of affairs, I think.
Hugely, yes. So anyway, when it comes to immigration, it depends where you land on the importance of national borders. I think you can say biblically that the government have a responsibility to protect citizens. I would also say that you have to be very careful about saying explicitly that national borders and border policy are definitely biblical policy. The Bible was written at a time when that kind of thing just didn't exist. I think that you have to also be careful when it comes to things like some of what Trump's doing around climate and energy, the withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. While you might quibble with the agreement, does it signal that he's just not going to take any interest in the preserving of the natural world around us? When it comes to diversity and gender and inclusion, I think most people would be delighted that the official policy of the US government is that there are only 2 genders, male and female.
Yes, although just to pause on that one, like that is an incorrect use of a word, isn't it? Like there are 2 biological sexes.
Yes, that's right.
Like gender, if the distinction we've always made is there's biological sex and there's gender, and gender is someone's own kind of way of identifying.
Yes.
Well, then the thing which is binary is biological sex. It is not gender.
Yes, indeed. And the interesting thing with that as well is it will be challenged. So the Human Rights Campaign has said it will fight back. They advocate on behalf of LGBTQ plus people. You also have, with the economy, I think probably a good thing where he's asked every US federal department and agency to address the cost of living and to come up with a plan to do so. He set up the Department of Government Efficiency, which again, if you're more inclined to believe that small government is better and therefore efficiency is good, and cutting down of bureaucracy, which is a big problem in America. And interestingly, this one I don't think you can really have a Christian position on, but he's renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and he's also renaming Mount Denali
Denali
in Alaska
to McKinley, yeah.
to Mount McKinley in honor of the 25th American president, who of course famously introduced tariffs. But interestingly, not a single executive order about tariffs was introduced, despite all the publicity being he's going to introduce tariffs on all these countries, it's going to be awful, and Britain's going to suffer as a result. So they're just some of what he's done. He's also suspended or postponed the implementation of a law that would ban TikTok, Chinese-owned TikTok, by 75 days. And he was personally thanked, apparently, by, I think it was the Chinese vice premier.
I'm sure he was.
But whether what happens there. The other thing, interestingly, from a Christian point of view, is he's begun the process of withdrawing from the WHO, the World Health Organization. And that organization, I think, has a lot of policies that, from a Christian perspective, are really disturbing. And so, again, that could be seen as a good thing. So there's just some of what he's done, but he's certainly a man in a hurry.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, there are some things there which I think are particularly good. I think it is definitely a good thing that he's sort of taking the fight back effectively against wokeism on gender, and also the diversity, equality and inclusion policies, which don't tend to... I guess that is the whole premise of that is that you're not colourblind.
Yes.
And of course we would believe that everyone is equal, regardless of their biological sex or regardless of their race or their age, and therefore policies which are sort of almost doing a reverse discrimination are probably not really going to be a very, very good idea.
I think I wonder if just a couple of kind of key Bible texts that I think are just useful to kind of name when it comes to thinking about Donald Trump. For me, the first one is 1 Samuel 16:7, which is the Lord looks at the heart. And I think that does suggest a primacy of character over just what a person does. And that's not to disagree at all with everything that you've said around, the fact that evil rulers can accomplish good ends. So I think that's one verse. I think another one would be, and this is interesting, so when you had the split between within Israel and ultimately a judgment on Solomon, and Rehoboam and Jeroboam led the split. And in 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 16, we read, the Lord will give Israel up because of the sins Jeroboam has committed and has caused Israel to commit. Now, the specific sins there from the context is the setting up of idols, and that the people then followed those idols and were led astray. And the point is that under the Old Testament system, the king had a particular responsibility because they were to be a shepherd to the people, and they could very easily lead the people astray because the people would follow them in their wicked ways. The principle I think you can draw across is that the way that leaders, prominent leaders who are filling up our news screens, filling up our social media feeds, the way that they behave and speak and talk about others and talk about the policies they're implementing, that will have an impact on how others behave. Not that everyone will follow them slavishly. Donald Trump is not a king like Jeroboam. There are constraints within the American system on his power. He's not a dictator despite all of the scaremongering. But the principle that the leader does have a formative impact on the people, I think is still a principle that applies and is worth just bearing in mind. Again, it's the suggestion that character really does matter from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think probably two other reflections, and then we probably ought to start thinking about the impact on the UK of all of this. Two further reflections. The first is, I think any Christian who is raising Trump up on this godlike pedestal is bound to be let down. And it will be exposed as the shallow view that it really was, with no substance to it. And the passage which really comes to mind, which actually I think does happen with Jeroboam. It also happens back with the golden calf, is when they lift up their idols, and the phrase is uttered, "Here are your gods," and they are shown to be just like made of metal. Donald Trump is a human being. He is fallible. He is flawed, and he is not your savior. And he will be shown to be flawed because that is what he is. So you can't sort of say he is definitely God's ordained saviour and he cannot do any wrong, because he is not. The second thing, which I think is would be my real challenge to all those who think that the alliance with Trump is worth it for what it achieves, would be, I don't think for Christians we get to say the end justifies the means.
No.
Because we're not predominantly called to be successful in what we do in this life. We are called to be like Jesus. We're called to be Christ-like.
Yes.
And that is God's purpose for us, to be conformed to the image of his Son, not to be the ones who manage to tick off jobs A, B, and C.
Yes, and the problem, one of the problems with the end justifies the means is essentially it's a form of utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Where you're justifying everything based on, well, it causes the maximum happiness for the most amount of people. Well, actually, that is not a biblical way of thinking
Absolutely
at all.
not.
I think the other thing that I would just add, and then we really must come to talk about Britain, is, when it even comes to his policies, I think what we've seen from Donald Trump 2.0 is, I would argue, perhaps a less pro-life president than everybody thought back in 2016. And so this whole thing of, he's going to really sort out the whole abortion issue. Well, he has been supportive in terms of the issue being returned to states, but he has not been straightforward then in what he has said. And I think there's definitely been a softening of maybe not a softening of his views because he may have always held them, but publicly there's been a softening as he's tried to reach out to a broader coalition of voters. So I'd make that point just because I think it's important to make. But there is also a way that we can assess the policy platform, policy proposals that Donald Trump implements from a Christian perspective. And later this year, we're going to release a new resource, God in Government. And one of the chapters in that looks at what does God require from human governments. And I won't go into a spoiler now, but that acts as a way, drawing especially from the wisdom of Proverbs, it acts as a way that we can assess, is Donald Trump and the government that he leads, is it meeting the biblical criteria? And no government will do that perfectly. But I suspect when we look back on the next 4 years and assess it biblically, I would hope at the very least that Christians would come to a more nuanced position of going, it's not even as simple as some things he did well and some things he did badly. It's even more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But you want to talk about the impact it's going to have on Britain, because we have a foreign secretary who I think once labelled Donald Trump something like a sociopath, was it? Something like that?
I believe that word was indeed used.
And we have a Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, who leads a centre-left or left-wing party, arguably the most left-wing government we've had for some time. In just about every respect, they're the polar opposite of Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And so how do you think Donald Trump 2.0, what impact do you think that's going to have on Britain and politics here?
Well, I suspect Trump himself will take a fairly dim view of them. I think from Britain's point of view, obviously we have a historic relationship, a relationship with a country rather than with an individual, and so it's not the case that we are.
Sorry, carry on. You're doing great work.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just dying here.
It's not the case that we're going to sort of suddenly change our policy because we don't like the guy in the White House. But I think it is a real challenge, and I think the challenge for Keir Starmer is broader than just a Trump challenge, which is the world generally is starting to swing back to the right, because there has been this sort of liberal consensus for probably the last decade or two, and that is now not the direction things are going in. So you've had Trudeau just resign in Canada, you've had European elections where you've got a rise of the right, you've got Trump back in the White House.
Argentina's got a very right-wing president.
So Keir Starmer almost is starting to look like the outlier. Yes. So it will be fascinating from that point of view. I guess the other thing which is sort of quite interesting is we now have a situation where our government is quite clearly having a great barney with someone who is effectively in the Trump administration, in Elon Musk, who has been appointed into this sort of government efficiency role by Donald Trump. And Musk has been putting out all kinds of things, essentially in response to the scandal around grooming gangs.
Yes.
But really kind of dramatic stuff, sort of saying the king should dissolve parliament and have a new general election kind of thing. And so that is going to be really interesting from a diplomatic point of view.
Yes.
How can you have someone who's effectively acting on behalf of the US government and of the UK government so at loggerheads?
And we also have a situation where the prime ministerial appointment to be the ambassador to the US, which is Peter Mandelson, who famously is one of three founders of New Labour, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Peter Mandelson. And actually the mood music from the Trump camp in recent times has been, we're not really sure about this. I personally think that his appointment will be ratified and accepted. But the very fact that we're having all of these stories saying, we're not sure, just shows you the challenge that the current administration here in the UK have. And I think they're alive and alert to it. I mean, they've met, Keir Starmer, David Lammy met with Donald Trump in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, and there were stories that came out saying that actually it had gone well.
Yep, I heard that. Yep.
And I think that, at the end of the day, Britain and America have such strong historic links that you would hope that, I think that relationship is important. I think it's sometimes overstated with the whole special relationship chat. But I do think that strength and that history of relationship means I think it can withstand. It withstood diplomatic problems even when Theresa May was Prime Minister, when Donald Trump came to the UK on a state visit and slated her approach to the Brexit negotiations in the British press, and then had to stand up at a press conference and he actually apologised for it, which was fascinating. So I personally think it can survive that. I think it'll be more difficult. The Americans want a trade deal. The UK wants a trade deal. I think the power is massively skewed to the Americans' favour. So time will tell. Yeah.
What do you make of the effect of Elon Musk has been through his posts on X over here in the UK?
I mean, I think a lot of people have left X as a result of Elon Musk taking over. I think that Elon is a fascinating character. I mean, he's not a natural communicator in person. He's has a slightly odd speaking style. Of course, I'm in danger now of being cancelled by Musk himself, but what a badge of honour that would be, Peter. This podcast will be blacklisted by...
He believes in free speech. He's not going to criticise you for that.
Yes, I'm always nervous about people who tell me passionately they believe in free speech, because I usually think, well, how free do you really want it to be? But I think it will have an impact. It's this whole new dynamic of a very senior Trump advisor and ally being so critical of Labour, so critical of Keir Starmer, as you said, particularly over the grooming gangs and what happened in a tragedy in Stockport last year. Was it last year? 2 years ago. Southport, sorry, not Stockport, Southport.
Last
year, wasn't it?
Last
summer. And so, I mean, the government will have to figure out how they're going to navigate that. And I mean, I don't really have any advice for them except don't rise to him.
I mean, I think regardless of what the government's positions are on sort of national inquiries into things like the grooming gangs case, the language which Elon Musk has been using, I would view as pretty unacceptable, and I would actually call dangerous in some cases. So I think if you're going to call Jess Phillips a rape genocide apologist,
it's ridiculous.
I mean, that is. Of course, it is not directly calling for violence at all, but is absolutely the kind of thing which people might seize on in order to kind of make threats against her. And you've also got to bear in mind, this is in the context of a situation where in the last 10 years, we have had 2 MPs murdered.
Yes.
One of whom was, in fact, by those on the far right in the UK. So we're not operating in some sort of neutral position here.
No. I mean, let me just give you Proverbs 18:21, which reminds us the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. And I think that speaks to the wisdom that we find in the Bible about weighing your words carefully and using them wisely. That, by the way, applies not just to Elon Musk. It applies to everything that can be said about what happened in Southport when it comes to national grooming gangs and the inquiries. And the fact the government have not done a national inquiry into grooming gangs, they've done a local inquiries, which I personally find, I'm not sure that is the right response, although I'm glad they're doing something. And then you also have a public inquiry now into what happened at Southport because of state failings and the fact that initially it was, it's not terror related, and lo and behold, it turns out that it probably was.
Exactly.
And I think that it's right that we have a public inquiry, though sadly these things take ages, and by the time they actually produce the report, we may even have a new government.
Absolutely. I think one of the big themes which we have always talked about is the importance of truth and grace. And it is difficult, I think, in this situation, to get at the truth, because various things, the government have sort of said, we don't want to kind of release this information yet.
Yes.
That was certainly part of Keir Starmer's reasoning for not releasing bits of information to do with the Southport attack. In that personally, I think he is a lawyer and he likes to play things by the book as opposed to there being some nefarious conspiracy going on. But on things like the grooming gangs scandal, it is, I think, really, really important we get to the truth on that. My problem with, say, someone like Elon Musk is you get neither truth nor grace.
Yes, that's right.
So you certainly don't get grace, but then he is sort of platforming figures like Tommy Robinson, who are well, he is a convicted criminal on any manner of reasons, none of which relates to the fact that he has spoken up on grooming gangs.
You know, and actually, when it comes to issues of grooming gangs and also violence and how people are incited into violence and how people are incited into terrorism and the fact that now people have been radicalized in their bedrooms, that's the big line from the Prime Minister. I think he's probably right. I think there's two things I would just quickly say. One is it shows that we are living in an increasingly difficult kind of landscape to navigate when it comes to legislation and how do you respond well. The other thing that concerns me is you're seeing the same kind of thing that the governments always do, which is here's a big problem. We've got all these laws pertaining to the problem, but actually it turns out none of them are really working. What do we need? More legislation. And the risk then to free speech and freedom of expression actually is very real. For the church, for Christians, I would just plead, be wise about how you talk about these matters. Be alive and alert to the fact that not everything you read online or even in mainstream media is true and accurate. And if you don't know what is true, you are not obliged under God to form an opinion.
Absolutely.
You can say humbly, I don't know. And I just think that the whole church in this country would be better served if we had a little bit more of a, do you know what? I don't need to be an expert on everything. I can just back off.
Yeah, it's almost like humility is a Christian virtue, isn't it?
What do you know? God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that's again and again. I suspect that the arrival of Trump raises both an opportunity for our podcast and a danger. The danger being that we end up talking about him far more than either you or I really want. But secondly, an opportunity, because actually the impact here, and that's going to continue. There's going to be a lot more to say about that relationship. And so here's to, hopefully, a great 2025 on the Engage podcast.
Absolutely.
There's loads more we probably could say, but I feel like we should draw stumps for this episode. But we are committed to you, our loyal listeners and watchers. Tell us what you're enjoying. If you want to hear more of our reflections on Trump, if you want to hear a bit more of an international flavor on the podcast, tell us. We're not promising we'll listen to you, but we are promising that whatever we do, we'll do it with truth and grace.
Absolutely.
And then the second thing is, if you like this podcast and you would be kind enough to give us a review, particularly if it's a positive review, then please do so, because all of that increases the legitimacy of the Engage podcast. And whatever you do, tell your friends about it. Get it in their headphones so that when they're on the commute and they're thinking, what am I going to listen to? I've got a horrible commute ahead of me. No more. Instead, let your mood be lifted with the Engage podcast. What a way to start January 2025.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Peter, great to be back with you.
Fantastic to be doing this again.
We'll be back soon with another Engage podcast. Until then, goodbye.
Take care.